The scent of salt air and expensive saffron wafted through the cliff. An architectural marvel of glass and steel perched precariously over the jagged rocks of San Francisco's coastline. Below the Pacific Ocean churned with a violent rhythmic hunger, a fitting backdrop for a sterling family reunion. I sat at the center of a circular table, draped in linen so white it looked surgical. To my left sat my father, Arthur Sterling, the chief operating officer of a pharmaceutical titan, a man whose heart beat in sync with the Nasdaq. To my right was Eleanor, my stepmother, a woman who treated social status like a competitive sport and her face like a gallery of expensive clinical interventions. "Happy 30th, Maya," Arthur said, though he didn't look at me. He was checking his Patek Philippe. There was no cake, no wrapped box, not even a card. 30. Eleanor sighed, swirling a vintage Chardonnay. The decade where the biological clock starts ticking and the tax brackets stop being forgiving. "You've had a good run, dear, but everything has an expiration date." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. "I assume we're not here to discuss my skincare routine." "Eleanor, what's going on?" Arthur didn't waste time. He never did. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a sleek obsidian black tablet. He slid it across the table. It didn't land with a thud. It landed with the digital chime of a notification. "Sign it," he commanded. I looked down. The header read, "Irrevocable release of patrilineal interest and voluntary disownment agreement." "You're firing me?" I asked, my voice steady, though my stomach performed a slow, nauseating roll. "From the family." "Don't be dramatic, Maya," Arthur snapped. "It's a strategic divestment. For 21 years you were a dependent. For the last 9, you've been a convenient shell for our family's secondary holdings. But as of 12:01 a.m., tomorrow, the IRS closes the legacy loophole we've been using to offset Julian's venture capital losses against your personal tax ID. You are no longer a high-yield asset. You are a liability." Eleanor leaned in the scent of her Chanel No. 5, cloying and thick. "We've already prepaid for your apartment for the next 3 months. We aren't monsters. But Julian is marrying Clara next month, a senator's daughter, Maya. The sterling name needs to be lean. We can't have your pedestrian career as a data analyst cluttering the family's consolidated financial audit." I looked at the tablet. My father had spent 30 years treating me like a line item on a balance sheet. I was the tax-efficient child, the one who stayed quiet, worked hard, and didn't cost them a scandal. "You kept me around for the tax breaks," I stated. "It wasn't a question. We kept you because it was mathematically sound." Arthur corrected his voice as cold as a morgue. "But the math has changed. If you sign this, you get a one-time severance of $50,000. If you don't, I will personally ensure your security clearance at the National Institute of Genetics is revoked by Monday morning. I have friends on the board, Maya. Don't test the depth of my reach." I looked at the sign here box, glowing blue on the screen. Most daughters would have shattered. They would have screamed or begged or let a tear ruin the expensive tablecloth. But I wasn't most daughters. I was my mother's daughter, not Eleanor, my real mother, Sarah Vance. The woman Arthur had erased from the history books after he stole her patents and let her die in a state-funded ward while he climbed the corporate ladder. I didn't cry. Instead, I felt a familiar electric hum in my veins, the thrill of a data set finally coming together. I reached out my fingers, hovering over the glass. I began to tap. Not a signature, a rhythmic, deliberate sequence on the bezel of the tablet, a haptic override code I'd spent 6 months perfecting. "What are you doing?" Eleanor hissed, glancing around to see if the tech moguls at the neighboring tables were watching. "I'm just reviewing the metadata," I whispered, my smile sharpening into something predatory. "You taught me well, Father. Always check the fine print before you close a deal." I scrolled down past the legalese, past the boilerplate threats, until I hit page 17, clause 4b. Did you really think I wouldn't notice this? I asked, turning the screen toward Arthur. His eyes narrowed. For the first time in 30 years, I saw a flicker of something that looked remarkably like fear. That's just standard indemnity, he muttered. Standard? I laughed, the sound cutting through the ambient jazz of the restaurant. This clause transfers all executive responsibility and legal culpability for a company called Vanguard Bio directly to me. A company you founded in my name when I was 19. A company that, according to the SEC filing I intercepted this morning, is currently under federal investigation for $5 million in fraudulent clinical trials. The color drained from Arthur's face. You didn't just want to disown me, I said, leaning forward until I could see the sweat beading on his forehead. You wanted to use this disownment as a legal Trojan horse. You wanted me to sign my own arrest warrant so Julian could walk down the aisle with a senator's daughter while I sat in a federal cell for your crimes. Eleanor reached for my hand, her voice suddenly frantic. Maya, darling, think of the family. Julian is the future. You've always been so independent. You can handle a few years of litigation. We'll hire the best lawyers. Quiet, Eleanor, I said. The sheer coldness in my voice silenced her. I tapped the screen one last time, triggering a remote upload. You think you're the only ones who know how to audit a life I've been auditing yours since the day I realized my mother's death certificate was signed by a doctor on your payroll. Maya, listen to me. Arthur started, his voice cracking. No, I said, standing up. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like the person who was about to crash the market. The dinner is over, Arthur. And the audit. It's just beginning. You said I was no longer a high-yield asset. I leaned down, whispering directly into his ear so the waiters wouldn't hear. You were wrong. I'm the most expensive mistake you've ever made. I didn't wait for the main course. I walked out of the cliff, the salt air finally smelling like freedom. Behind me, the Pacific roared, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the drown. I was the storm. The tension escalates as Maya forces the Sterling family to face the consequences of their greed within the high-pressure environment of the restaurant. The silence at the table was no longer the cold, sterile quiet of a corporate boardroom. It was the suffocating heaviness that precedes a massive structural collapse. Arthur Sterling sat frozen, his hand still hovering near the obsidian tablet, as if he could somehow reach into the glass and pull back the data I had just unleashed. Vanguard Bio. I repeated my voice, projecting just enough to make the couple at the next table, a pair of venture capitalists I recognized from the Forbes 30 Under 30 list, glance over. $5 million in misappropriated federal grants. 3 faked clinical trials for a blood clotting agent that didn't actually clot. And every single filing bears a digital signature linked to my social security number, executed from an IP address, registered to this family's estate in Atherton, Ott. Eleanor's composure, usually as unyielding as a diamond, began to fracture. She adjusted her silk scarf, her eyes darting nervously toward the restaurant's entrance. Maya, lower your voice. You're being hysterical. There must be a clerical error. Your father would never... My father didn't just never, I cut her off. He calculated. He knew that as a data analyst with a clean record, I was the perfect fall girl. If the SEC came knocking, he'd point to this disownment paper and say I was a rogue element, a disgruntled daughter who used her access to frame the family. Arthur finally found his voice, though it was stripped of its usual booming authority. It was a low, desperate hiss. You think you're so smart, Maya? You think a few screenshots of metadata will stand up against a legal team that costs more than your annual salary? You sign that document or I will destroy you. I will call the dean at the institute. I'll tell them you've been selling proprietary genomic sequences to offshore buyers. By Monday, you won't just be disowned. You'll be unhireable, a ghost in the industry. I pulled out my own phone, a custom encrypted device that looked like a standard model, but ran a kernel of my own design. I tapped the screen, and a live feed of a spreadsheet appeared. "Go ahead, Arthur. Make the call," I said, sliding my phone next to his tablet. "But before you do, take a look at the live ledger for the Sterling Family Trust. Do you notice the drip algorithm I installed 3 weeks ago? Every time you threaten me, the program authorizes a micro transfer of $5,000 to a public whistleblower bounty fund. You've already donated $25,000 to the very people who are going to prosecute you since we sat down for appetizers." Arthur's face turned a shade of purple that matched the expensive Pinot Noir in his glass. He realized then that I hadn't just been checking the fine print. I had been performing a hostile takeover of my own life. "You're a monster," Eleanor whispered, her eyes wide with genuine horror. "No, Eleanor," I said, leaning back as the waiter arrived with the main course, 3 plates of Wagyu beef that no one was going to touch. "I'm an analyst, and I've finally identified the cancer in the system." Just as the tension reached its breaking point, a shadow fell over the table. A young man with perfectly coiffed hair and a smile that had been bought with 3 rounds of veneers approached. It was Julian, my brother, looking every bit the Silicon Valley prince in a tailored navy blazer. Behind him was Clara, the senator's daughter. She was beautiful in that effortless East Coast way, wearing a string of pearls that probably cost more than my college tuition. "There they are," Julian chirped, oblivious, or perhaps intentionally ignoring the carnage at the table. "The happy family. Sorry we're late. The valet line was a nightmare." He pulled out a chair for Clara, who smiled politely but looked at my father's ashen face with a hint of confusion. "Is everything okay, Mr. Sterling?" Clara asked, her voice melodic and refined. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Arthur forced a smile that looked like a grimace. "Just business, Clara. You know how it is. Maya was just about to sign some papers for her birthday." Julian looked at me, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of pity and triumph. "Oh, right. The Independence Day papers. It's for the best, Maya. Really, once you're off the family books. Clara and I can finally close on the penthouse in Hayes Valley without any extra baggage." I looked at Julian, the golden child, who had spent his life failing upward, fueled by the sacrifices Arthur had forced me to make. He didn't even know he was a hair's breadth away from a federal indictment. "The baggage isn't mine, Julian," I said, my voice dripping with a newfound coldness. "It's built into the foundation of this family, and I think it's time Clara saw exactly what she's marrying into." Julian's smile faltered. He looked at Arthur, then at Eleanor, finally sensing the radioactive atmosphere. "Maya, don't be a killjoy. This is a celebration. Clara's father is announcing his endorsement for the biotech subcommittee tomorrow. This isn't the time for your little grievances." "It's exactly the time," I countered. "Because, Julian, while you were picking out the marble for your Hayes Valley kitchen, our father was busy signing your name and mine to a series of fraudulent clinical trials. Clara, did you know that the Vanguard startup Julian brags about at cocktail parties is actually a front for a $5 million tax evasion scheme?" Clara's eyes widened. She turned to Julian, who started stammering. That's a lie. Maya's just jealous. She's always been the outlier. She's trying to blow up the wedding because she's bitter." "Enough!" Arthur roared, slamming his fist on the table so hard the silverware rattled. "Maya, you will leave this restaurant right now. We will settle this in private with the lawyers." "Clara, Julian, please excuse her. She's been under a lot of stress at the Institute." "I'm not going anywhere, Arthur," I said, checking my watch. "And we aren't waiting for your lawyers. We're waiting for my guest." "Guest?" Eleanor spat. We didn't authorize a guest. This is a private family dinner. He doesn't need your authorization, I said, looking toward the entrance. He owns the building. In fact, he recently bought the controlling interest in Sterling Farmer. The air seemed to leave the room as a tall man in a charcoal grey suit stepped out of the shadows of the lounge. He moved with a quiet, lethal grace that commanded the attention of every person in the room. This was Elias Thorne, a man who lived in the stratosphere of global finance, a billionaire who avoided the press, but pulled the strings of half the companies in the valley. Arthur stood up so fast his chair nearly tipped over. Mr. Thorne, I didn't realize you were in San Francisco. We were told you were in Davos. Elias Thorne didn't acknowledge Arthur. He walked straight to our table and pulled out the empty chair next to mine. He sat down, looked at the Wagyu beef, and then looked at me. You were right, Maya, Elias said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble. The saffron here is excellent, but the company a bit lacking in ethics. Arthur looked like he was about to have a stroke. Maya, you know Mr. Thorne. Maya is the reason your company still has a functioning R&D department, Arthur, Elias said, his eyes turning to my father like a predator assessing a wounded animal. She's been acting as my lead forensic auditor for the last 18 months. While you were busy trying to frame her for your incompetence at Vanguard Bio, she was busy mapping out every offshore account, every faked trial, and every cent you've stolen from the Sterling Farmer Pension Fund. Julian looked at Clara, his face pale. Clara, to her credit, didn't scream or cry. She simply stood up, her pearls catching the light. Is this true, Julian? She asked, her voice trembling. Did your family use federal grants to fund your lifestyle? My father's reputation is on the line. If this comes out… Clara, honey, it's not what it looks like, Julian pleaded, reaching for her arm. She flinched away. Don't touch me. I think I've heard enough. She turned to me, a flash of respect in her eyes that surpassed the social divide between us. Thank you for the warning, Maya. I'd rather be a jilted bride than a co-defendant. As Clara walked out, Julian let out a strangled cry of frustration. He turned on me, his face twisted in a snarl. You bitch! You ruined everything. You were supposed to be the quiet one. You were supposed to just let us handle things. I've been handling things for 30 years, Julian, I said, standing up to meet his gaze. I handled your tuition bills. I handled the messes you made in high school. I handled the silence when Mom died. But I'm done being your ghostwriter. I'm writing my own story now. Elias Thorne stood up next to me, his presence an impenetrable wall of power. Arthur, I believe you have a tablet you need to hand over, not for Maya to sign, but for me. It's a formal notice of termination. You are being removed as COO of Sterling Farmer, effective immediately. And as for Vanguard Bio, the FBI is downstairs in the valet lounge. They've been waiting for the signal Maya just sent from her phone. See, the restaurant, once a sanctuary of the elite, suddenly felt like a cage. Arthur looked at Eleanor, who was staring into her wineglass as if searching for a way to disappear. He looked at Julian, who was trembling like a leaf. Finally, he looked at me. You'll lose everything too, Arthur whispered, a final, pathetic attempt at leverage. If you take us down, the Sterling name is mud. You'll be the daughter of a felon. I already lost everything the day you let my mother die so you could keep her patents, I said, my voice clear and unwavering. The name Sterling isn't a Crown Arthur. It's a debt. And tonight I'm marking it as paid. I turned to Elias. Ready to go? The car is waiting, he said, offering me his arm. As we walked away from the table, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could hear the sound of the FBI agents entering the room, the hushed gasps of the other diners, and the frantic, useless shouting of a father who had finally run out of time. We stepped out onto the terrace. The wind was cold, but for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the chill. I looked out over the Pacific, the dark water reflecting the lights of the city. "What now?" Elias asked. "Now," I said, taking a deep breath of the salt air. "I find out what happens when the variables are finally under my control." This is the continuation of the saga, where the power dynamics shift from a family dinner to a corporate execution. The valet stand at the cliff was swarming with more than just luxury sedans. 3 black SUVs with government plates had effectively blockaded the circular driveway, their headlights cutting through the San Francisco fog like glowing predatory eyes. As Elias Thorne and I stepped out of the lobby, the cold Pacific air hit my face, sharp and invigorating. For the first time in 30 years. The oxygen didn't feel like it belonged to my father. Behind us, the restaurant's glass doors swung open again. Arthur and Eleanor stumbled out, followed closely by a shell-shocked Julian. They weren't walking with their usual Atherton strut. They were being escorted. 2 men in windbreakers with FBI emblazoned in yellow across the back walked on either side of my father. "Maya, stop this!" Eleanor shrieked, her voice cracking against the roar of the waves. "You're making a spectacle. Think of the neighbors. Think of the club." I stopped and turned. Elias stood half a step behind me, a silent titan of industry whose very presence seemed to suck the light out of my father's world. "The club doesn't accept felons, Eleanor," I said, my voice carrying over the wind. "And as for the neighbors, I'm sure they'll enjoy the property value boost when your estate goes up for federal auction." Arthur looked at me, his eyes bloodshot. His silk tie loosened for the first time in my living memory. "You think Thorne is your savior. He's a shark, Maya. He'll use you just like I did. You've handed him the keys to the kingdom for a moment of petty revenge." "It's not petty, Arthur. It's an audit," I replied. "And Elias didn't use me. He hired me. There's a fundamental difference you've never been able to grasp. One involves a contract, the other involves a hostage situation." One of the agents, a stern woman with a badge clipped to her belt, stepped forward. "Arthur Sterling, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud violation of the False Claims Act and identity theft. You have the right to remain silent." As the handcuffs clicked a sharp metallic sound that seemed to echo off the cliffs, Julian let out a pathetic, stifled sob. He looked at me, pleading. "Maya, please. I didn't know. I just did what Dad told me. Talk to them. Tell them I'm innocent." "Innocence requires ignorance, Julian," I said, looking at my brother. "But you weren't ignorant. You were just lazy. You didn't care where the money for your Hayes Valley condo came from as long as the direct deposit hit on the first of the month. You signed the Vanguard bio-expense reports. I have the digital trail." Julien's face went ghost white as he was led toward the second SUV. Clara had been right to run. The Sterling name wasn't just mud, it was toxic waste. Elias leaned in close. "The press will have the story by the 4 a.m. cycle. By the time the markets open, Sterling Pharma will be in a free fall. That's when we trigger the final phase of the acquisition." "And Arthur's shares?" I asked. "Frozen," Elias said with a thin, predatory smile. "By tomorrow afternoon, you'll be sitting in his office. Not as an analyst, but as the court-appointed conservator of the Vance patents." I looked out at the ocean. The debt was being called in, and the interest was staggering. The following Monday, the Sterling Pharma headquarters in South San Francisco felt like a cathedral after an earthquake. The glass and chrome lobby, usually buzzing with the frantic energy of scientists and lobbyists, was eerily quiet. The ticker in the lobby showed the stock price a jagged red line plummeting toward the floor. I walked through the security gate. My old badge, the one that labeled me as a junior analyst, didn't work. I didn't mind. I reached into my bag and pulled out a new one, Maya Vance, Interim Director of Intellectual Property. Elias Thorne was already in the executive boardroom on the 40th floor. He was standing by the window looking out at the bay. On the mahogany table sat a single, weathered cardboard box. It looked wildly out of place in a room that cost more than most people's houses. "What's this?" I asked, setting my laptop down. "The Legacy Archives," Elias said, turning around. "When I took control of the server room last night, I had my team dig into the physical storage in the basement. Arthur kept a private safe. This was in it." I walked to the box and opened the lid. Inside were handwritten journals, old floppy disks, and Polaroid photos of a lab that looked nothing like the high-tech facility we were currently standing in. I picked up a photo. It was my mother, Sarah Vance. She was younger than I am, now wearing a lab coat that was 2 sizes too big, grinning in front of a centrifuge. Her eyes were bright, with the kind of pure, unadulterated curiosity that Arthur had spent his life trying to monetize. "He didn't just steal her patents, Maya," Elias said softly. "He stole her time. These journals contain the original sequences for the CRISPR variant she was developing. Arthur suppressed the final chapters because the cure was too efficient. It didn't require a lifetime of maintenance drugs. It was a one-time fix." I felt a lump form in my throat. Arthur hadn't just used me as a tax shield. He had held back a breakthrough in genomic medicine because it wasn't market optimal. "He's a monster." I whispered the words, tasting like ash. "He was a businessman," Elias corrected. "And in this valley, sometimes they're the same thing. But today, the business changes." I sat down at the head of the table, Arthur's chair. It was leather expensive and smelled faintly of his cologne. I opened my laptop and bypassed the corporate firewall using the back doors I'd built months ago. "I'm releasing it," I said. Elias raised an eyebrow. "The Vance sequence Maya that's worth billions. If we patent it under the new Thorne-Vance entity, we could control the market for the next 20 years. "No," I said, my fingers flying across the keys. "That's what Arthur would do. That's what Julian would do. I'm uploading the entire sequence to the open-source bioregistry. I'm making it public domain." Elias walked over to the table, leaning down to look at my screen. "You realize you're walking away from a fortune. You could be the richest woman in biotech by sunset." "I don't want to be the richest woman in biotech, Elias. I want to be the woman who finished her mother's work," I replied. "Besides, I've already audited the family's hidden offshore accounts in the Caymans. I took the liberty of diverting the administrative fees Arthur owed me for 30 years of being his tax shield. I'll be just fine." Elias chuckled, a rare, genuine sound of amusement. "You really are a shark, aren't you?" "I'm a Vance," I corrected. I hit the Enter key. A progress bar appeared. "Uploading to Global Biomedical Database. 12%, 45%, 88%. As the bar hit 100%, a notification popped up on the boardroom's main screen. The news had already broken. Arthur Sterling had been denied bail. Julian was being questioned by the SEC. And Eleanor's various social clubs had issued a joint statement distancing themselves from the unfortunate Sterling affair. Sure. But beneath the scandal, a new headline was beginning to trend. Vance Sequence released a new era for genomic freedom. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes. The weight that had been pressing down on my chest since I was a little girl, the weight of being a line item, a liability, a disappointment, was gone. The door to the boardroom opened. A young woman, an intern I recognized from the lab downstairs, stood there tentatively. She looked at me, then at Elias, then at the box of old journals. "Ms. Vance?" she asked. "The research team. We just saw the upload. Is it true? Is the sequence really open for everyone?" I looked at the photo of my mother one last time before tucking it into my pocket. "Yes," I said, a small, genuine smile forming on my lips. The debt has been settled. Now let's get to work. The aftermath of the dinner at the cliff didn't just break the Sterling family, it shattered the very foundation of their reality. In Silicon Valley, reputation is a currency more volatile than Bitcoin, and by Monday morning, the Sterling name was trading at zero. I stood on the sidewalk of Sand Hill Road, the epicenter of global venture capital, watching the physical manifestation of a liquidation event. Federal agents were moving through the glass-walled offices of Sterling Pharma like a swarm of silent, methodical locusts. They weren't just taking computers, they were taking the history of a lie. Elias Thorne stood beside me, his hands buried in the pockets of a tailored overcoat that cost more than my first 3 years of salary. He looked at the building with the detached interest of a man watching a controlled demolition. "The board of directors is in a state of anaphylactic shock," Elias said, his voice a low rumble beneath the sound of distant sirens. They spent a decade believing Arthur was a visionary. Now they realize he was just a very sophisticated looter. They're looking for a sacrificial lamb, Maya. They want to pin the entire Vanguard fraud on Julian. Julian is a convenient target because he's incompetent, I replied, watching a forensic team wheel out a rack of black site servers. But incompetence isn't a crime. Malice is. And the malice started with my father. The scene shifted that afternoon to the Sterling estate in Atherton. If the office was a clinical execution, the house was a crime scene of vanity. Eleanor Sterling was standing on the manicured lawn, surrounded by Louis Vuitton luggage that looked absurdly out of place against the backdrop of federal yellow tape. "You can't do this!" she shrieked at a bored-looking marshal. "That piano was a gift from the Sultan of Brunei. It's an antique. It's an asset purchased with commingled funds from a fraudulent clinical trial ma'am," the marshal replied without looking up from his clipboard. "Move back behind the line." I stepped out of the SUV, and Eleanor's eyes locked onto mine. The transformation was startling. Without her weekly appointments at the world's most exclusive med spas, the cracks in her porcelain facade were showing. She looked like a woman who had finally realized that the gold leaf on her life was just a thin layer of paint over rotted wood. You little Judas!" she screamed, charging toward me. Elias moved to intercept, but I held up a hand. I wasn't afraid of her anymore. "Is that the best you can do, Eleanor?" I asked as she stopped inches from me, her breath smelling of expensive gin and desperation. Biblical metaphors, I'd expect something more creative from a woman who spent 20 years pretending to be a philanthropist, while my mother's legacy was being bled dry in the basement. "We gave you everything," she hissed, her voice cracking. "The schools, the clothes, the access. You were a nobody until Arthur gave you his name. He didn't give me his name, Eleanor. He lent it to me so he could use it as a firewall," I said. "And as for everything, you gave me a front-row seat to a masterclass in sociopathy. I've spent 30 years auditing your lies. Today I'm just closing the books." Eleanor crumbled. She didn't fall. She simply deflated, clutching her designer bag as if it were a life raft. "What are we supposed to do?" "Julian is in a holding cell. Arthur won't take my calls. We have nothing." "You have exactly what you deserved," I said, turning back toward the car. "You have the truth. It's a very small, very cold room, Eleanor. Get used to it." As we drove away, Elias looked at me with a curious glint in his eyes. "You're cold, Maya. Efficient. I like it. But remember, the courtroom is a different kind of theatre. Arthur is a cornered rat, and a cornered rat doesn't care who he bites." "Let him bite," I said, looking at the digital files on my laptop. "I've already had my rabies shots." The United States District Court for the Northern District of California felt less like a hall of justice and more like a gladiatorial arena. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the electric hum of 100 high-end smartphones. The Sterling biofraud was the trial of the century for the tech elite. a cautionary tale about what happens when the fake it till you make it culture of the Valley meets the unyielding wall of federal law. I sat in the front row, directly behind the prosecution table. I wore a suit of deep charcoal, my hair pulled back in a severe professional knot. I wanted to look like what I was, a ghost who had returned to collect a debt. Arthur Sterling sat at the defense table. He looked diminished. His custom-made Brioni suit hanging loosely on a frame that seemed to have shrunk 3 inches in a month. But his eyes were still sharp, predatory, and flickering with a desperate, dying light. To his left sat Julian, looking like a lost child in a man's world. Julian had spent the last week trying to negotiate a plea deal that would keep him out of a federal penitentiary, but the government wasn't biting. They wanted the big fish, the lead prosecutor. A man named Marcus Vane, who had a reputation for eating CEOs for breakfast, called his first witness. The government calls Julian Sterling to the stand. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The golden son was being forced to testify against the king. Julian walked to the stand with the gait of a man heading toward a gallows. He wouldn't look at his father. He wouldn't look at me. Mr. Sterling. Vane began, his voice smooth and dangerous. Tell the court about Vanguard Bio. Who came up with the idea to use your sister's identity to secure federal research grants? Julian's voice was a thin, wavering thread. My father did. He told me it was a way to streamline the bureaucracy. He said Maya wouldn't mind because she wasn't using her credit anyway. And the $5 million that went missing. The money meant for the pediatric heart stent trials, Shimtin. It went into the Hayes Valley project, Julian whispered. And some of it went to pay off my margins on the crypto crash. My father said we'd pay it back before the audit. He said Maya was our insurance policy. The defense attorney, a silver-tongued hired gun named Sterling, no relation ironically, jumped up. Objection, hearsay. The witness is clearly under extreme duress and attempting to shift blame for his own profligate spending. Overruled, the judge barked. For 3 hours, Julian dismantled the Sterling myth. He painted a picture of a household where morality was a secondary concern to the quarterly earnings report. But then the defense had their turn. Mr. Sterling, the defense attorney said, leaning over the witness stand. Isn't it true that your sister Maya was the one who actually built the server architecture for Vanguard? Isn't it true that she had super user access to every account? Isn't it true that she is the only person in this room with the technical skill to fabricate the very evidence she provided to the FBI? Julian looked at me, then his eyes pleading. I don't know. You don't know, or you don't want to admit that your sister is a scorned woman who decided to burn down her family because she felt undervalued. She did. The attorney turned toward the gallery, pointing a finger directly at me. The defense moves to designate Maya Vance as a hostile co-conspirator. This isn't a whistleblowing case. This is a coup d'etat. The courtroom erupted. Arthur actually smiled, a thin, yellowed grin of triumph. He thought he'd found the loophole. He thought he could turn my intelligence against me. The government calls Maya Vance to the stand in rebuttal, Vane said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. I walked to the stand. I took the oath. I felt the weight of every eye in the room. Ms. Vance, Vane said, the defense suggests you fabricated the evidence against your father to facilitate a hostile takeover of the family assets. How do you respond? I didn't look at Vane. I looked at the jury. I am a data analyst. In my world, there is a concept called the immutable ledger. It's a record that cannot be changed without leaving a digital fingerprint, a ghost, in the code. I opened a black leather folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The defense claims I fabricated the Vanguard servers. But they forgot one thing. My father is a man of the old world. He didn't trust digital signatures for the big moves. I held up the paper. This is a physical authorization for the transfer of $2 million from the Vanguard Research Fund to a private account in Zurich. It was signed in ink. On the back of this paper is a series of handwritten notes, formulas, actually. I looked at Arthur. His grin was gone. These formulas are for a gene silencing sequence, I continued. A sequence my mother, Sarah Vance, perfected 20 years ago. A sequence that Arthur Sterling suppressed because it cured the very disease his flagship drug only managed. He didn't just steal the money, he stole the future. Objection, the defense screamed. Relevance. The relevance, Your Honor, I said, my voice rising for the first time, is that my father used this fraudulent money to hide the fact that he was liquidating Sterling Farmers' R&D department. He was selling off my mother's life's work to offshore buyers. This wasn't a business. It was a fire sale of human progress. I turned to Arthur, the man who had spent 30 years telling me I was a liability. You told me I was a bad investment, father, but you forgot the first rule of the market. You never bet against the person who knows where the bodies are buried, especially when you're the one who dug the holes. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb. Arthur Sterling slumped in his chair, his eyes glazed, looking every bit the ghost I had sought to make him. As I stepped down from the stand, I walked past the defense table. I leaned down just close enough for Arthur to hear me. "Happy birthday to me, Dad," I whispered. "The audit is finally over. And you're bankrupt." I walked out of the courthouse and into the blinding San Francisco sun. Elias Thorne was waiting. He didn't say a word. He just opened the door to the SUV. We drove away from the cameras, away from the wreckage, and toward a future where the name Vance would finally stand on its own. The Sterling era was over. The Vance era was just beginning. This is the final, expanded conclusion to the genetic debt saga. These chapters delve deep into the psychological fallout of the Sterling collapse and the meticulous process of Maya building a new world from the ashes of the old. The courtroom victory had been a clean surgical strike, but the emotional debris of the Sterling Empire still lay scattered across the Bay Area. Arthur Sterling's name had been scrubbed from the boards of every philanthropic organization in California, and Julian's golden boy status had evaporated overnight, replaced by the cold, hard reality of a federal plea deal. But for me, the audit wasn't over. I didn't just want my father in a cell. I wanted to recover the soul of the woman he had spent 2 decades trying to erase. A week after the sentencing, the air in South San Francisco was thick with the scent of salt and rain. I stood in the lobby of what was once Sterling Farmer, now a ghost ship of glass and steel. The building was under the control of a court-appointed receiver, a man whose only job was to turn the company's assets into liquid capital to pay off the millions in fines and victim restitution. Elias Thorne met me at the security gate. He didn't look like a corporate raider today. He looked like a weary architect. "The liquidators are moving in tomorrow, Maya," Elias said, his voice echoing in the hollow atrium. "They're going to sell off the lab equipment first, then the intellectual property. If there's anything left of your mother's in there, we have exactly 2 hours to find it before it becomes government property." "I don't need 2 hours," I said, pulling a heavy brass key from my pocket, the one I had retrieved from the hidden compartment in Arthur's Atherton library. "I only need access to the sub-basement archives." We descended into the bowels of the building, past the state-of-the-art CRISPR labs and the high-speed sequencers. We moved into the Legacy Vault, a humid, cramped space filled with filing cabinets that predated the digital age. This was where Arthur kept the inconvenient history, the failures, the lawsuits, and the research that didn't fit the profit margin narrative. I walked to a cabinet marked Vance, 2004 to 2006. The metal was cold and slightly rusted. As I turned the key and pulled the drawer open, a scent hit me that stopped my heart, peppermint and old paper. It was the scent of my mother's office when I was a child. Inside were hundreds of handwritten pages. Arthur had claimed her research was lost in a server crash. In reality, he had printed it out and buried it in the dark so he could patent a watered-down version of her work. I pulled out a thick, blue, leather-bound journal. My hands shook as I opened to the final entry, dated just days before the accident that took her life. Arthur is no longer pretending. He's obsessed with the stock-to-patient ratio. He told me today that my gene silencing therapy is too final. He wants a drug that people have to take for 40 years, not a treatment that fixes them in 40 minutes. I've realized I'm not his partner. I'm his R&D department's greatest threat. I've hidden the final sequence in the one place he never looks the background data of Maya's school projects. He thinks I'm just a doting mother. He doesn't realize I'm a strategist. If you're reading this, Maya the ghost is in the machine. Use it to burn his house down. I sank to the concrete floor, clutching the journal to my chest. The betrayal was so much deeper than financial fraud. He hadn't just stolen her career. He had intentionally suppressed a cure for a rare pediatric neuroblastoma because a cure was a bad business model. He had let children die for the sake of a dividend. He knew, I whispered the words, catching in my throat. Elias. He knew she had the cure, and he buried it because it was too effective. Elias knelt beside me, his expression grim. That's the difference between an innovator and a profiteer, Maya. An innovator wants to solve the problem. A profiteer wants to own the problem. I'm not going to own it, I said, wiping my eyes and standing up with a newfound icy clarity. I'm going to liquidate it. I spent the next 3 hours scanning every page into an encrypted cloud server. I wasn't just taking my mother's work. I was taking back her voice. By the time we left the basement, I wasn't just a daughter who had won a lawsuit. I was a scientist with the most powerful weapon in the history of medicine. The Vance Foundation for Open Science didn't launch with a gala or a press conference. It launched with a single massive data dump on a public server. I sat in my new office, a modest glass-walled space in a refurbished warehouse in the Mission District. No marble, no mahogany, no gold leaf, just whiteboards and high-speed fiber-optic lines. Elias Thorne sat across from me, watching the global download counters on a wall-mounted monitor. The server in Zurich is at capacity. Elias noted his eyes reflecting the blue light of the screens. The University of Tokyo just mirrored the entire database. The Vance sequence is officially public domain. You just wiped $10 billion in projected pharmaceutical revenue off the map, Maya. The big labs are going to hate you. Let them, I said, sipping a coffee that cost $4 instead of the $50 lattes at the Cliff. They can't sue a ghost, and they can't patent a public secret. My mother wanted this to be free. I'm just her delivery girl. But there was one final audit to perform. That afternoon, I drove to the Federal Correctional Complex in Dublin, California. I wasn't there to see Arthur. I had already seen enough of him to last 10 lifetimes. I was there for Eleanor. The visiting room was a bleak beige box that smelled of industrial floor cleaner and despair. Eleanor was led in by a guard. The transformation was total. The social queen of Atherton was gone. In her place was a woman in a shapeless orange jumpsuit, her hair greying at the roots, her skin sallow. She sat down and stared at me through the plexiglass, with a hatred so pure it felt physical. "What do you want, Maya?" she spat. "Did you come to see the ruins, to make sure I'm miserable enough for your satisfaction?" "I came to give you an update, Eleanor," I said, my voice level. "The Atherton house was sold yesterday. The proceeds went into a trust for the families who were defrauded by Vanguard Bio. Your jewelry auctioned, the Bentley seized. Even your private collection of designer bags is currently being sorted for a charity resale." Eleanor's lip curled. "You're a monster. You've left us with nothing." Julian is living in a studio apartment in Oakland, working as a junior clerk for a public defender. A clerk, Maya. After everything we did for him, Julian is learning the value of $1 he actually earned, I replied. And as for you, Eleanor, you'll be out in 18 months. But you won't be going back to the club. I've arranged for a permanent lien on your future earnings. Any money you make from book deals, interviews, or social media will go directly to the Vance Foundation. You wanted to be a part of the Sterling legacy well. This is it. You're the collateral. See, Eleanor slammed her hand against the glass. You think you're so much better than us. But look at you. You're cold. You're calculating. You're exactly like Arthur. No, I said, standing up. Arthur used people to build a monument to himself. I used Arthur to build a bridge for everyone else. That's the difference between a predator and a surveyor. Goodbye, Eleanor. I've paid your final bill. I walked out of the prison and felt the sun on my face. It was a crisp, clear day. I drove to the cemetery overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge. I found my mother's grave, a simple, elegant stone that had been hidden in the shade of a large oak tree. I sat on the grass and pulled the blue leather journal from my bag. We did it, Mum, I whispered. The ledger is balanced. The Sterling name is a footnote. The Vance name is a cure. I left the journal on the headstone for a moment, letting the wind ruffle the pages. I realized then that my life hadn't been a series of tragedies. It had been a long-form audit. I had tracked the debt, identified the fraud, and executed the recovery. Elias Thorne was waiting for me by the car. He looked at me as I approached, his usual stoic mask, replaced by something resembling genuine respect. "What's the next move, Maya?" he asked. "The board of the new institute is waiting for your signature on the bylaws." I looked out at the bridge, the orange steel glowing in the setting sun. The genetic debt was paid. The vanguard was defeated. And for the first time in 30 years, the data was clean. The next move? I asked, a small, true smile forming on my lips. We stop looking at the past and start coding the future. But first, I think I'm going to go buy a birthday cake, one with chocolate, and 30 candles. "I'll drive," Elias said. As the car pulled away, the lights of San Francisco began to twinkle, a city of dreamers, sharks, and visionaries. I wasn't afraid of the sharks anymore. I knew how they swam. And I knew exactly how to drain the tank. The genetic debt, the air on the 40th floor of the new Vance Research Collective, was different from the stifling, ozone-heavy atmosphere of Sterling Pharma. Here the walls were made of smart glass that adjusted its transparency based on the position of the sun, and the layout was an open-source dream, no mahogany doors, no executive silos. Just a sprawling landscape of whiteboards and high-speed sequencing clusters. I stood by the window looking out over the San Francisco Bay. The morning fog was retreating, revealing a city that felt for the first time like a playground rather than a battlefield. My 31st birthday had passed 6 months ago, marked by a quiet dinner with Elias and a few lead researchers. There were no legal documents on the table that night. Only a chocolate cake and a discussion about protein folding. The final batch of the pediatric neural repair sequences just cleared the peer review server, a voice said behind me. I turned to see Sarah Thorne, no relation to Elias, just a brilliant young analyst I'd recruited from a public university. She was holding a tablet, her eyes bright with the kind of unfiltered excitement I hadn't felt in years. "The results are a 99% match with your mother's original projections," she continued. "Maya, because we released the data, open source, 3 different labs in Mumbai, Berlin, and Sao Paulo have already started synthesizing the enzyme. They're predicting the first clinical trials will be free for patients by the end of the year." I looked at the data scrolling across her screen. I looked at the data. It was beautiful. It was clean. It was the ghost in the machine finally given a physical form. Good, I said, a sense of profound stillness settling over me. Make sure the Brazil team has access to our latest folding simulations. I don't want them hitting the same bottleneck Arthur did. As Sarah hurried away, Elias Thorne stepped into the lab. He wasn't wearing his charcoal suit today. He was in a dark sweater, looking more like a venture capitalist on a weekend than a corporate shark. He leaned against a lab bench, watching the activity around us. "You've done it, Maya," he said quietly. "You didn't just burn down a kingdom. You built a republic." The Sterling name is officially a case study in business ethics textbooks now. I hear Arthur's legal team tried to file for a compassionate release last week. Denied. Arthur doesn't deserve compassion, I said, my voice steady. He deserves time. Time to sit in a room with nothing but his own thoughts, and the realization that his legacy is being dismantled by the very person he thought Chethy was his greatest liability. Elias nodded. And Julian sent me a letter from the minimum security facility in Oregon. I admitted, reaching into my pocket and pulling out a crumpled piece of stationery. He's working in the prison library. He said for the first time in his life, he doesn't have to pretend to be a genius. He's just a man who organizes books. He thanked me for stopping the clock. I walked over to a central display, a holographic projection of a DNA strand. It wasn't just any strand. It was the Vance sequence glowing with a soft, ethereal blue light. This was my mother's soul, rendered in light and mathematics. "Everything has a price, Elias," I said, looking at the projection. "My father thought the price was paid in dollars. My stepmother thought it was paid in social standing. But the real price was the truth. It took me 30 years to find the right currency." Elias walked closer, his gaze following mine. "So the audit is officially closed." "The audit of the Sterlings is closed," I replied. "But the work of the Vances is just beginning. We have 30 years of suppressed research to catch up on. We have diseases to move from managed to extinct. We have a world to fix that Arthur tried to keep broken." I tapped the holographic display, and the DNA strand began to replicate, branching out into a million different possibilities. It was no longer a secret locked in a basement or a weapon used to threaten a daughter. It was a gift. "I used to think my life was a zero-sum game," I said, turning to Elias. "I thought for me to win, they had to lose. But I realize now that true victory isn't about the destruction of your enemies. It's about the creation of something they can never touch." "And what is that?" Elias asked. "Hope," I said, "and the absolute unyielding power of an accurate ledger." I walked toward the door, stopping for a moment to look back at the lab. My researchers were huddled in groups, debating, laughing, and building. The air was filled with the sound of a future that wasn't for sale. I stepped out onto the balcony, the wind whipping my hair across my face. I looked at the horizon where the Pacific met the sky. Somewhere out there, a child was going to get a treatment they could afford. Somewhere a mother wouldn't have to choose between her house and her child's life. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small silver locket I'd recently found among my mother's things. Inside was a photo of her and me when I was 5 years old. We were sitting in a park, and she was pointing at a butterfly, her face lit with a smile that Arthur could never dim. "The debt is paid, Mum," I whispered into the wind. "The books are balanced. We're free." I closed the locket and walked back inside. There were more sequences to map, more data to analyze, and a world that was finally blissfully under new management. The Sterling era was a shadow. The Vance era was the light. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just the analyst. I was the architect.